All right, let's talk about the Gothic. And no, we are not talking about emo kids walking around in black with eyeshadow. Um, the Gothic comes from the Goths, who were one of the Germanic tribes to start sacking Rome. One of the many tribes that sacked Rome, the Goths, the Visigoths, all the Goths, destroying Rome. Um, and they brought with them, whereas Rome was the height of classicism, the Goths brought with them a very different style of architecture and aesthetic that was very different than that of the classical forms. Um, One of the things with the Gothic tradition is you see the arches, the flying buttresses that are discussed in the chapter. And the purpose of these is to allow light into the space. Um, Light was considered sacred. It was a physical manifestation of the divine. And of course, when you live in a world where bad things happen after dark, light can be something worthy of being sacred because it's what keeps you safe. It's safer when it's light out. Um, so churches, cathedrals, palaces, all were designed with the idea of bringing light into the building. Um, the uh, the We look at the stained glass that we find uh, throughout Christendom at the time, and the stained glass serves a few different purposes. Number one, it's beautiful, and the bringing beauty into this sacred space is supposed to help people appreciate the awe of God, of the divine, right? As you look at, um, again, talking about the idea of light, you not only have light, but you have multicolored light fracturing and scattering all around you, and it creates this wonderful sacred effect. But not only that, a lot of the people of the time simply weren't literate. They couldn't read. And so stories were told in the stained glass windows. And so people could come in and look at these beautiful representations and learn the stories of God and of the Bible through the stained glass. Um, One of the things we see here is the Jesse trees, which goes back to the biblical prophecy of supposedly the Messiah descending from the line of Jesse, which is the line of David, and supposedly Mary was a descendant of Jesse, and so that in turn gave her the right to be the mother of God. Uh, um, as mentioned earlier, the rib vaulting, etc., was designed to help bring the spiritual to mind. They talk about the flying buttresses and the groin vaults there on 426. Um, so let's take a look at the idea of sculpture. As we saw previously, we after uh, after Rome started to fall apart and we had the Holy Roman Empire, there was this movement away from lifelike representations into more of these flat, angular, uh, not so realistic, not proportioned images, lacking shadow, things like that. And with the Gothic, we start to see a revival of these more realistic figures, figures with depth, figures with expression and emotion that had been absent for some time. Um, Looking at the figures on the jam statues there on 430, um, these classical principles start to come back. Um, and they're brought back again in order, much like the stained glass windows, to tell stories. right? To tell the stories of the Bible and to reintroduce that which is sacred. Um, Music also takes on a different, not just tone, uh, but it starts to take on a lineage. Um, so, for example, the Magnus Liber Organi, the Great Book of Polyphony, was distributed about 1160, and Leonin, who wrote Alleluia Dea Sanctificatus, sorry, my Latin is a little rusty. Um, and this is where we start to see specific authors get credit for their work. Um, Prior to this, works were created orally and they were passed down person to person without really one person, quote unquote, owning a piece of work. Now we start to see authorship, and this is introduced at this time. Um, his successor, Peretin, revised this work, um, and we see the Viderant Omnis, where we start to see counterpoint introduced, to where somebody is somebody is singing while another person is singing this other uh, harmonic parts against it, and so these counterpoints, this opposition, creates a tension within the music. Um, we start to see more rhythmic innovation that mirrors this, the Gothic cathedral, right, to where music starts to fill the space. Um, when I was in high school, we sang at St. Mary's Cathedral, and it's got this just incredible spire that goes up above where you sing. And so as you sing, it's almost like a trumpet bell, to where the music goes up into the cathedral, and then after bouncing around up there, it comes back down in this wash of sound to the entire area, to the bell, right? So you have this spire, and then the seating area, the choir's in the middle, sound goes up, comes back down, and it's just an incredible, incredible sound. Um, in this, the tenor line keeps your standard line, whereas, and then you have other parts that provide the counterpoint. And what we start to see at this time is the introduction of the organ uh, to uh, to the to singing, to where the organ then because it's hard to get a lot of it's hard to, especially back then, to find enough quality singers to provide all the parts. And so the organ would be used to provide that baseline part off that the tenors often sang, that you didn't have to find as many quality people. And so the tenor provides that part, and then you just have the counterpoints needed to be sung. And with the organ, the way the organ makes sound with the blast of air worked really nice in these Gothic cathedrals, because again, they had all this space, and so the organ could fill that space. It was able to provide enough sound to fill the space up and provide just this majestic sound into the space. A lot of instruments couldn't provide enough sound, and with the organ, especially moving so much air, it would just fill the space. Um, we start to see at this time also the introduction of music into education. And for example, Notre Dame, not Notre Dame, that's a college, but Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, started to provide music as part of its curriculum. And we see during this time also the rise of the laity getting an education, the common person being able to get an education as a university. And this transformed everything. You, quite frankly, have the right to come to college because of these changes that were made, because until then, universities were strictly limited as far as who could attend. And education is the great equalizer in social class, in power, education provides that opportunity. Um, the first university was founded in 1088 in Italy, in Bologna. Um, Although there were institutions of higher learning in the Islamic world before then, um, which were degree granting, but nothing quite at the level of the university. And university just means a union between the instructors and the students. That's what a Langston University is, a union between you and me. Okay, that's the point. Um, and then, so proficiency in Latin was required because Latin was the language of the scholar. So, excuse me, in order to become a part of the university, a part of this union, you had to know the language. The University of Paris was chartered in 1200, and then shortly thereafter, you have Oxford, you have Cambridge, the great universities of England. Um, these universities emphasized theology, the study of religion, um, but there were other options as well, medicine, law, etc. Um, and this is also where you start to see the implement of dormitories, where students could live on campus and not have to try to provide for themselves, live in the world, but they were focused in living on campus. Um, Paris was the most famous university at the time. Um, Books were limited, okay, and so uh, lecturers would have their copies of the books, but then students had to take notes based on the lectures because you didn't have the book. Books were scarce. Um, Abelard was probably one of the most famous scholars of the time. Um, he taught he taught using a dialectic, which presents different points of view on a subject, and then in class you're supposed to come to some kind of a reconciliation of these seemingly at odds positions. It's very much like the Socratic method. It draws heavily on it, this question and answer that we saw with Socrates early on. Um, it's the ability to find meaning in seemingly uh, oppositional standpoints, right? Okay, this is claimed to be truth, this is claimed to be truth, what is the actual truth? And of course, this doesn't go over so well with a church that maintains that there is only one truth, right? And not only is there only one truth, but the church has the sum total of that truth. This type of teaching method creates the opportunity for problems within that. Um, and so Abelard uh, was opposed very adamantly by the church. Um, the other thing that happened to Abelard at this time that put him at odds is he ended up having an affair with one of his female students, Heloise. He got her pregnant, um, and her uncle, needless to say, was pissed about this. And so, in order to stop the affair, he had some men capture Abelard and castrate him, remove his testicles, uh, so that he could no longer get anyone pregnant. Um, Needless to say, Abelard had to, at that point, step back. Um, he went and joined a monastery. Heloise joined a nunnery and ended up becoming abbess. And this became known as the most popular romantic poem of the era, The Romance of the Rose, the story of Abelard and Heloise. Um, and this basically the whole idea is this tells a story of a man trying to capture and deflower a rose. Um, and the guardians then the guardians of the rose find out about, etc. A whole beautiful, beautiful story. Um, the versions of the poem, Ewan's version, was poeticized and valorized. That's sexual references were made by it. And Heloise, of course, in it confesses to have lewd thoughts towards him. Um, so the Romance of the Rose, a well-known poem of the era, and really a remarkable piece of literature. Um, Universities did not, as a rule, allow women to be a part of the university. There were exceptions to this, but by and large, women, if they were to get an education, it was a private education, as in Abelard being a private tutor for Heloise. So it wasn't that women couldn't be educated, they were just not supposed to be educated in the spaces of men. Um, like I said, there were exceptions. For example, the author of the Trotella created a medical text for women, and it's actually for the time a very remarkable text. It talks about having a good diet, talks about not being stressed out, um, use of a form of anesthesia, opiates. Okay, but for then anesthesia during childbirth. And it also explains how you can pretend to be a virgin if you're not. So, important work for the time. Um, at this point, we also have this idea of scholasticism come forth, and scholasticism based on the idea of the dialectic discussions of Abelard, um, which theologians there's this battle between faith and reason, right? Between logic and just trusting in God. And the dialectic provides an opportunity to explore how this might possibly be resolved. And we see St. Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the scholastics of the time, set out to take on many of these issues that that were faced. Um, he wrote the Summa Theologia. Summa, you might recognize the root of the word summary, right? And basically, it's all that's known on a particular subject, everything that is talked about. And he tried to write a summa, a summary of theology, which, oh my God, what an incredible undertaking. Write everything that's known about theology. Ready? Go. And this is what Aquinas attempted to do. Okay, Louis IX, the radiant style. Louis was a very dedicated man, very dedicated to the advancement of the church. The One of his most important contributions, the Chapel of Saint Chapelle. Basically, he set this up. It's interesting. He set it up so that the royal family would enter from the palace directly from where the stained glass windows are above everybody, and then the court officials and everybody else came through this smaller entry below. So this is a Palatine chapel. In other words, a palace chapel, and this was kind of his invention. Louis was also was a natural reformer. He wanted to move the church forward, and he allowed a lot of this dialogue and debate that a lot of times was left out. The church didn't want debate, quite frankly. Um, so people were allowed. The scholastics, Aquinas was allowed to have these conversations. Um, had royal commissioners in the provinces to ensure that people were being treated fairly. He got rid of serfdom. He got rid of private wars between smaller states within France. Um, he reformed the tax structure to make it more appealing and easier for people to become stable without being robbed, essentially, by the crown. And he also gave his people right to appeal decisions to the court itself. Um, So I mean, a genuinely good man in a lot of ways who tried to do a lot of good. Uh, and so, guess what? He was sainted by the church. Thus, Saint Louis or Saint Louis. So, for those of you from the St. Louis area, this is the man that your city is named after. Um, we have the miniature tradition, which are these beautifully painted pieces, very small. Um, I'm not going to get into too much detail on the miniatures tradition. Um, okay, let's talk about the Gothic in Italy, 440. Um, Despite the church typically being headquartered in Rome, there was a schism. The Pope, we ended up with multiple popes, one of which was in France. The one that a lot of people followed was in France. Um, really kind of captured um, political power. Really rested in city states, and really in with the merchants, not so much with the aristocracy. The aristocracy was there, but a lot of them weren't very wealthy. And so what would oftentimes happen is an aristocrat who had no money would marry a merchant family with money. The aristocrat got money. The merchant family got the title. And so there was a lot of that going on at the time. And because there was all these city states as opposed to unified governments in there, the different cities would really kind of compete with each other to see who could build the nicest place. Right? It's like, oh, hey, Venice just got a new chapel. All right. So if Venice got a chapel, what is Padua gonna do? Okay. So they'd go back and forth to try to one up each other. Um, we also had the introduction of these new mendicant orders, uh, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Um, Dominicans, Thomas Aquinas, the most famous theologian, and then the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi. Now, the Benedictine monks, which is what we've talked about largely in the past, retreated from the world. And these orders did not retreat from the world. They were out in it, they were involved, um, and because the church had often been thought of as, well, because the monks kind of held back, the church was thought to have been isolated from the world, and they don't really understand what's going on. These orders being out and active and being a part of what's happening allowed the church a new face uh, with the people. And a lot of people felt that these, because things were happening behind the scenes, and because the church was so wealthy and powerful, they felt that the church was corrupt. And let's face it, a lot of times the church was corrupt. But these mendicant orders said, we're not going to hold any wealth. We are going to forego any trappings of wealth. And this allowed them to build trust with the people because they weren't trying to take money and they weren't trying to put on gaudy shows of display. Um, Dominicans focused very much on preaching, whereas the Franciscans were focused on prayer, fasting, scourging themselves. You've seen people with the whips. That's one of the things that they did. And while they were both known for these things separately, as time went on, these things started to overlap with each other, and so they kind of took on their traits of each other. And unlike church, some of these elaborate, gaudy Gothic structures that are huge, Mendicant churches were very simple. Okay, very Spartan. There wasn't a lot to them. Um, so rich families would often, though, contribute to many of these uh, churches, either the fancy ones or the more simple ones, in order to essentially buy salvation. It's like, oh, hey, yeah, I went out and I killed a couple of people, but I built a church, and so I'm okay. I'm all right. literally the thought process at the time. Um, Pope Innocent III sanctioned both of these orders, both the Dominican and Franciscans, um, and he went so far as to say that the emperor was the Pope was to the emperor as the sun was to the moon. In other words, the only way that the emperor has any power is because his power is a reflection of God's power, which is which shines on the emperor through the Pope. And this sets the kind of this precedent of the Pope being able to essentially tell somebody you're not king anymore. Now, how often that was followed depended on the situation, but the Pope started wielding just a tremendous amount of secular authority. He was also the one who formalized church hierarchy that we talked about before with Charlemagne, but he really formalized it from Pope to Cardinal to Bishop to Priest. He also formalized the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the belief that the bread and the water the bread and the wine at Mass actually physically transforms into the body and blood of Christ. He also made annual confession and Easter communion mandatory for all Christians. So you probably have heard saying, "Oh, they're just an Easter Christian," right? Easter and Christmas, right? Well, that's because that comes from this idea of those are the two ones that you really have to go to. The Pope really focused on life and death situations a lot of times, whereas the Mendicant orders focus on spiritual salvation. So you have these two forces now at work within the people that deal with both their physical and spiritual well-being, kind of formalized into the church structure at this point. We talk about Francis of Assisi. Okay, Assisi kind of became frustrated with the life of wealth. He was the son of a wealthy merchant, and because he saw the problems that wealth would cause, and he encouraged people to lead a simple life. Okay. We are going to move from the Gothics, into Siena and Florence in the 14th century and the evolution of humanism. Please don't forget to do your discussion boards.